Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to the rustic Vaughn Lodge, where today I am talking about H.P. Lovecraft once again, and starting a new series on this channel, which is the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. On Mythos Mondays, I have talked about a lot of H.P. Lovecraft stories, but I've never talked about all of them. So let's do that. I'll talk about all of the stories that you could find in your typical collection of the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. There are a few of those out there. And in many of those collections, the first story you'll find is a story called The Beast in the Cave. The Beast in the Cave, which is about exactly that. And there are some interesting things about that story. So for this series, I'm going to do the episodes just as you would find the stories in the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. Usually, if you have a good volume of the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, the stories are presented in the order that H.P. Lovecraft wrote them, which is important because you can see his progress as a writer and how his writing changed over time. And so that is how I'm going to be talking about these stories. A lot of these stories I've talked about before, but I'll talk about them again because there's a lot to say about a lot of these stories. Now, encountering Lovecraft for the first time, this probably isn't the way to do it. You can, but if you've never read Lovecraft before, maybe don't start at the beginning, because most of his really, really good stuff, those stories were in the second half of his career, for the most part. All of his Cthulhu mythos and all of that stuff, at least most of those. That all came later. But there's a lot of interesting things to say about his earlier stories. And you can start there. I'm not saying you can't. And so today we're starting with The Beast in the Cave. The Beast in the Cave. Like I said, this is a story very often. If you're reading the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, this is the first story that you will encounter. And it's interesting that you will encounter it because it's a very early story for H.P. Lovecraft. This was written it was finished in 1905. It wasn't published until 1918. And it was published in an independent magazine, amateur magazine, which was called The Vagrant, I believe. And that was in 1918, so a number of years after it was written. And when he completed the story, H.P. Lovecraft was only 14 years old. And so when you read this story, you will notice right away it's not quite as polished as some of his other stories. Still, it's an excellent story. And when you read the story, the first opening paragraph, I think, is a worthy one. The horrible conclusion, which had been gradually obtruding itself upon my confused and reluctant mind, was now an awful certainty. I was lost, completely, hopelessly lost in the vast and labyrinthine recesses of the Mammoth Cave. Turn as I might, in no direction could my straining vision seize on any object capable of serving as a guidepost to set me on the outward path. That nevermore should I behold the blessed light of day, or scan the pleasant hills and dales of the beautiful world outside, my reason could no longer entertain the slightest unbelief. Hope had departed. Yet, indoctrinated as I was by a life of philosophical study, I derived no small measure of satisfaction from my unimpassioned demeanor. For although I had frequently read of the wild frenzies into which were thrown the victims of similar situations, I experienced none of these, but stood quiet as soon as I clearly realized the loss of my bearings. So, that was a pretty good first paragraph for a 14-year-old H.P. Lovecraft to write. And we have our protagonist in the Mammoth Caves. And, not the brightest guy in the world, he decided to wander away from his tour guide and just, wander around the caves all by himself. And wouldn't you know it, he gets lost. He got lost. Small chance that his tour guide will find him. And eventually, he finds himself in pitch darkness, lost in pitch darkness in the caves. And then he hears some footsteps, but they don't seem to be the footsteps of a human being. They seem to be the footsteps of a beast of some kind, perhaps, a mountain lion that wandered into the caves, and has been surviving on, whatever's in the caves to eat. Like our hapless narrator. And so he hears this thing, and it seems to be walking around on 4 feet instead of 2, so he knows it's an animal of some kind. It's an animal of some kind. And he's sure it's an animal that's stalking him and it's going to eat him. So he feels around and finds a couple of rocks, There are a few of those in the Mammoth Caves. And so he found a couple of rocks. And he listens for where the thing is. And he throws a rock and he misses. And then he throws another rock and he gets lucky. He cracks it probably on the head because he hears a rock hit it and it just goes down. It flops to the floor of the caves. Then, a little bit after that, then he hears his tour guide who is looking for his dumbass, And they find each other. And the tour guide, he's got his flashlight there and everything, and he's like, hey, I just threw a rock at something and hit it. Can we go and take a look at what it is? And they go back and look, and it's just something awful and horrific. And I won't spoil what it was. That's what it was. It's the most horrible thing imaginable. So that ruins this. I spoiled the whole thing. Anyway, that actually wasn't what it was. But they see what it was. And it's just, ghastly and horrible. But then there is a revelation. There's a startling revelation at the end of the story. And in young Lovecraft fashion, he puts it in all caps at the end, just to really ram it home just how horrible this is. This is a twist ending that you could have seen a mile away. It is not what I would call a shock ending because it's, like I said, it's not the most brilliant twist in the world. But that's okay because H.P. Lovecraft was 14 years old when he wrote this story. And it's one of those early surviving stories that H.P. Lovecraft wrote when he was a kid. There were a couple other ones that have survived that he wrote when he was younger. And those are, pretty much terrible because he was a little kid when he wrote those. And you'll be able to find those usually at the back of some complete collections. But The Beast in the Cave has been judged good enough that even though he was written by a 14-year-old H.P. Lovecraft, it's usually stuck, or placed, I should say, at the very beginning of the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. And you know what? It is good enough to be there. the story isn't much. It's really, really short. It's really, really short. After you're done watching this, you could just type in The Beast in the Cave by H.P. Lovecraft, and a bunch of audiobook versions will pop up, and they're all like 17 or 18 minutes long. They're all going to be really short because it's a really short story. And so there's the situation is exactly what I described, all about this beast in the cave and this guy who got lost and encounters it and somehow manages to kill it with a rock. But the good thing about this story is the way it's written, the way it is told. You can tell just from that opening paragraph that opening paragraph by 14-year-old Lovecraft is clearly Lovecraft. I mean, his writing is, it's easy to spot. It is uniquely his own. But this is a Lovecraft who has not yet gotten a grip on his style. He was a tremendously intelligent kid, as is obvious from just the style in which the story is written. He was extremely well read, even at that age. And even though he hadn't got a grip yet on his style, later on he became the master of his style. This was still at the point where he was still working it out. And he spent a long time, to be fair, working out his style before he finally mastered it. That being said, this still is a really atmospheric, little, tiny horror story. And the bit, it was much better than the way I told it. The bit where he's in there, our narrator is in there, lost in the darkness, and he hears this thing out there in the darkness. He captures the fear of that situation. That is a primal fear that is built into us. If we're out in the dark and we can see nothing and we hear something and it's obviously an animal. I've been in this situation and it's unpleasant. It's an unpleasant situation to be in. I didn't throw rocks at the creature that I encountered in the darkness, but which was a better move, I think. But I've had that experience, and it's unnerving, to say the least. And he captures that, I think, in this story, at least for me. Me personally, I feel it is a worthy beginning of Lovecraft's career. And it is just, he starts off with this horror story. Lovecraft was always interested in the unusual and the strange and the weird. He had no interest at all in normal stuff. And so if you're reading the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, the stories that I will be talking about, you will be encountering a lot of horror. You will also be encountering fantasy and science fiction. All of it very weird. And frequently, all of these genres are all mixed together. And in a way, the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, which is, when I'm home at the manor, I will actually be able to hold up a volume. And you can see that it's a big volume, but even though all of these stories are all very different, and they were written over a length of time, they all hang together really well thematically. He creates a whole world of horror, H.P. Lovecraft does, and his stories tend to reference each other. And even though we have categorized his stories after he died, we've categorized his stories as his dream stories and his Cthulhu Mythos stories, which he never used that terminology for his stories. We have kind of divided up the stories, but Lovecraft never really did. He would reference in different kinds of stories. He would reference any of his stories could be referenced. You know, you'd be reading a dream story, and he'll reference some nightmarish horror that could be found in another type of story. He was interesting that way, H.P. Lovecraft does. And he was ahead of the game, you know. Stephen King has been doing the same kind of thing since he started writing in his career. So, The Beast in the Cave, it's a cool little creepy story. Obviously, like I say, it's amateur Lovecraft. It's a very young Lovecraft writing this thing. But it's really impressive that it's as good as it is. And so that is The Beast in the Cave. Those are my thoughts on this story. Catch me next time for, is it The Alchemist? I don't have my copy of the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, but I think that's what it is. And I will talk about that next time. Okay, guys, I will see you there. Are you the Beast in the Cave? I think so. What do you think, Zorro? I think so.